Hello, and welcome to part 2 of lecture 3 on the Hispanicization of the Northern Frontier. In this part of the lecture, we will finish up talking about the evolution of colonial institutions and then consider different aspects of Texas colonial society in the 18th century. The end of the 18th century leaves the Spanish colonial society of New Spain on the edge of the war for independence that Mexico will fight in the 19th century. So I want you to be looking ahead to that, because that will be discussed in Module 4. So be thinking about what to think about Texas in the 18th century prior to Mexican independence. So first, we will move to talking about towns and what has happened in urban areas over the 18th century, excuse me. By the 18th century, there were 4 main settlements in Texas. In East Texas, there was Nacogdoches, which was about 350 settlers by 1783. South toward La Bahia, the second settlement that I will talk about here, there were approximately 450 settlers living in and around the Mission and Presidio there in the same year. And in the Rio Grande area, the population of Laredo comprised 700 residents as of 1789. San Antonio became the largest city in Texas with 1,248 inhabitants by the end of the 18th century. Families of soldiers, Indian neophytes, converted Indians, and even those engaged in contraband commerce were all drawn to the cities of 18th century Texas. Cities were organized similarly as they are today in terms of government. You had what they called the alcalde, A-L-C-A-L-D-E. This was the mayor of that cared for the municipality's numerous needs through what they call the ayuntamiento. Even I have trouble with the Spanish sometimes. The ayuntamiento Ayuntamiento, which is also mentioned on the slide entitled Towns Spring Up. This is essentially a city council. There was one in and around each Spanish municipality. It functioned as the town council and as it had a wide range of administrative duties. The size of the council varied from population to population. It was responsible for executing imperial plans, building governmental structures, protecting the people's property in the towns, maintaining law and order, boosting town growth, enforcing morality, and organizing community functions. The ayuntamiento also interpreted royal directives and sometimes interpreted these rather loosely, bending imperial directives to meet the local and immediate needs of each town. In towns, people made their living through a variety of different jobs. Artisans served presidios and missions. Vaqueros even did seasonal work on ranches, but still sometimes lived in the towns. Teamsters transported goods and materials on carts pulled by livestock. Day laborers also performed a range of specialized tasks, and then there were the everyday bakers, tailors, that type of person that also lived in the cities. However, there were many issues living in towns in the Spanish Texas frontier of the 18th century. By 1731, Texas's non-indigenous population, meaning the people that were not Indians, stood at 500 persons. This rose to 3,000 people during the last half of the 18th century and 4,000 people, non-Indian people, by 1800. So Spanish settlers, Spanish colonial settlers, were still very much outnumbered by the indigenous living in and around the area that they had settled. There was a high birth rate, but also a high infant mortality rate for people living in towns in Texas. Continual warfare with Indians, farming methods that yielded a very small amount of agricultural foodstuffs, traditional notions of diet and hygiene, which were oftentimes rudimentary and poor. There were lack of doctors and hospitals, and there were periodic waves of virulent disease. For instance, epidemics swept through San Antonio in 1780 and really lowered the population there. Living conditions on the frontier. Building materials, masons used quarried rocks from the local area. Common people constructed homes from mud and the type of soil essential for adobe, which was found locally. So the townspeople lived in many ways very similarly to the way that the indigenous lived in Texas. Doctors, drugs, and hospitals rarely made their way to the far north, and the only hospital which operated for less than 10 years was founded in San Antonio, but wouldn't be founded until 1805. So it was a rough life living on the frontiers, even in urban areas. Attacks by Comanche and other plains tribes remained ever possible and ever present. Settlers brought with them many Spanish traditions brought from the Spanish interior, or from the New Spain interior. Settlers brought traditions like folk songs called corridos, which oftentimes celebrated Robin Hood type figures that upended traditional social roles. They also brought folk tales with them. Religious holidays were observed with a combination of Catholic solemnity and frontier charged enthusiasm. And they afforded, religious holidays afforded people a welcome sort of opportunity for entertainment. One of the most common forms of entertainment on the frontier was a dance called the fandango. These were festive dances in which some townsfolk would play guitars, and would play guitars and fiddles, and these provided the music, and then there were people who were dancing. This is all on the slide entitled Connections to the Interior, in case you're clicking along on the PowerPoint. The ranching culture that developed in Texas included horse races such as the Carrera del Gallo. This was a contest that took several forms. In one, mounted vaqueros raced at full gallop to be the first to reach down and pull off the head of a rooster buried to the neck in the ground. So you did have to make your own fun on the Spanish frontier. On the subject of education, the northern frontier of the New Spain colony, books and writings were largely the domain of the elite, government officials, and priests. Because Texas was essentially the definition of the middle of nowhere, even to many Latin American colonists, Tejanos in towns were largely unsuccessful at attempting to bring in teachers for schools. You also need to factor in the perspective that most were poor, and the uncertainty of the hinterlands. In the uncertainty of the hinterlands, the idea of education is sometimes viewed by colonists as ultimately useless on the frontier. The lack of books and teachers partly account for the absence of an educational system, but by the early 19th century, all the urban settlements had established some type of rudimentary educational facility. Communication was largely done through what they call the Camino Real. This is also discussed on connections to the interior. The Camino Real, which translates to the King's Road, connected Mexico to Texas over the King's Highway, also called the San Antonio Road. This artery traversed the province from San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande to Bayard and East Texas settlements. A second route extended from Laredo to La Bahia, then connected the road to the Trinity River. Mounted couriers regularly carried mail throughout New Spain to Texas towns. You can see several of the Camino Reals on the connections to the interior slide. There's a map here that shows you the establishment of these roads, the first of which was established actually in 1690. So let's move now to talk about social classes and race in colonial New Spain. Spanish-American colonial society was not a strictly biracial society, meaning that it was not separated into black and white, much the way that you would find English society separated. Spanish-American society had essentially 5 different classes, which you can see on the corresponding slide. I have provided a pyramid outline to show you how these different classes and races were structured. So this is hopefully a helpful outline. First were the peninsulares, or also called the peninsulars. They were born in Spain. Underneath this group formed the absolute elite of the elite in Spanish colonial society. Underneath this group were the Creoles, or in Spanish it's criollos. These were colonists born in the Spanish colonies to 2 Spanish parents. Mestizos fell underneath this group and were mixed race between Spanish and Native American parents. Below these were Indians and then enslaved persons, typically of African descent. The Spanish were incredibly concerned with the amount of racial mixing in the colonies, which had gone on over 3 centuries by the end of the 18th century. They created paintings like those depicted in this slide that categorized every possible racial combination. Many Spaniards even believed that through certain combinations a family could be cleansed, quotation marks, of African or Native American blood and become wholly Spanish again. These are, of course, ludicrous ideas, but they do show that the Spanish were just as concerned with racial purity as any other European colonial power, and created racist notions to justify their concerns. Later on, we will see that these distinctions take on even more political and economic importance, and we will talk about that in Module 4. Let us now turn to Africans in Texas. Tejanos on the frontier had a range of ethnic makeups, and they lived with a degree of sexual imbalance, meaning that men outnumbered women. This led to presidial soldiers and mestizos, which were the mixed blood people who descended from European and Indian parents, to mix with assimilated Indians, especially those around San Antonio. It is important to remember that the categories we talked about were from central New Spain in Mexico, and out in the frontier they became a lot fuzzier and a lot less discernible. The extent to which a person could claim that they were Spanish or claim Spanishness was important for social status. The 1780 census materials demonstrate to us that Españoles, or Peninsulares, Spaniards, made up about 1/2 of the population of the province. Those figures are misleading and did not designate undiluted Spanish blood. Rather, those figures served as an all-embracing label that described relative wealth, social and occupational standing, degree of cultural assimilation, and even the attitudes of census makers. Few Peninsulares actually lived in Texas, and those classified as such really belonged to the Mestizo or Creole categories. Spanishness derived from the idea on the frontier that those of darker skin hues and mixed blood could pass as Spaniards, especially when they had come to achieve some sort of social standing as ranchers, government officials, or military personnel. However, on the frontier, economic success tended to override racial makeup in one's classification. Lower-class mestizos and other people of color, such as mulattoes and slaves, however, almost always encountered difficulties in achieving the more prestigious status of Spanish. At another level, Hispanicized Indians, African descent people of African descent who had attained their freedom, and mulattoes might break through the mestizo stratum and attain the mestizo classification in a frontier society. So everything's always a little bit fuzzy in terms of race and class in the Texas frontier. I'll talk now about social structure and class in frontier societies of Texas. These, like I stated, did not necessarily mirror those of New Spain, and once again, wealth also separates people more so than even skin color does. However, if you could demonstrate that you acted more like a Spaniard, then you would be considered more of a Spaniard, especially if you were a small landholder or some sort of merchant or businessman. Slavery did not exist in the far northern frontier to the extent that it did in other parts of Spanish America. According to the census conducted in the latter half of the 18th century, the number of black persons in the province barely exceeded 50, the majority of which resided in East Texas, the region closest to Louisiana, from which some had actually run away. Most black people who were not slaves, whether they had arrived in Texas as fugitives or as free persons, they integrated themselves into colonial society, adopting Spanish surnames and learning the Spanish language. At least a few Tejano ranchers did acquire slaves in New Orleans, exchanging cattle for bondspeople, or through barter with the French living in neighboring Louisiana communities. And in the latter years of the century, some farmers living near Nacogdoches also held slaves. Although Spain did not follow a pattern of exporting Africans to the far northern frontier, the Crown did extend the official policy of slavery to Texas. This prohibited Africans from congregating, lest they supposedly planned for insurrection. So these are some of the legal ways that the Spanish enforce slavery. One is prohibiting Africans from congregating together, and another is prohibiting Africans from possessing firearms. These are all to guard against the possible slave insurrection or slave rebellion. Africans worked alongside other day laborers in an integrated workforce on the frontier. Field slavery of the type common in England's American colonies to the east and in parts of Spanish America in the Caribbean did not exist in Texas, because there was no cash crop economy in Texas at the time. So who exactly did own slaves? In Texas, as in most of New Spain, by the latter part of the Spanish colonial period, slave ownership was a matter of status, and most slaves provided domestic services. Present from the beginning of Hispanic settlement in Texas, slavery was closely associated with governors, military officers, and a few very prosperous individuals. Most slaves in the Texas frontier were actually female, which is tied to the domestic service aspect of slavery in Spanish colonial Texas. However, by 1806, male slaves outnumbered female slaves in Nacogdoches 39 to 36. And this has to do with sort of the changing types of people who are settling in Nacogdoches. Law and slavery was different in Spanish colonies than it was in the English colonies. At least in Texas, and despite the arbitrary practices that arose from the acceptance of the caste system or the class system that we talked about earlier, the law ideally respected the individual rights of slaves, including the right to gain their freedom. Now, what this means is that they saw, Spanish law saw Africans as individuals to a certain extent. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're nicer than the English, but law was very different under the Spanish code. Slaves could not seek redress for abuses and crimes committed against their persons and property, slaves could seek legal redress for abuses and crimes committed against their persons and property. Slaves also had the right to seek their freedom through purchase or to seek a new master on demonstrating good cause. Also, as in other parts of the Spanish Empire, in Texas, manumission at death, meaning the freeing your slaves, if you are a slave owner, you free your slaves when you die, was a common practice. For instance, Juan Flores de Abrego, who was a slave owner, he freed his female slave at his death in 1779. But required his male slave to remain in the service of his wife until her death, and then to return he would be returned to the estate as sort of a laborer. In Texas, as in Florida, another important aspect of Spanish slave law was the right of asylum for foreign slaves seeking refuge within the jurisdiction of the Spanish crown. This means that if a slave from an enslaved person from another European empire ran away to Spanish territory, they would be considered free. The surviving correspondence on Texas cases of this nature indicates that local and superior officials took seriously both the legal rights of the owners and the individual rights of the runaways. Spanish law divided colonial society into the República de Españoles and the República de Indios, each with its own code of law. People of African descent, including pure-blooded Africans, mixed-raced African American slaves, and others, were part of the República de Españoles, and although included in the same legal jurisdiction as Spaniards, were subject sometimes, often actually, to discriminatory ordinances. Most local laws did not distinguish between Afro-Mexicans and other castes, but some did. The 1751 regulation of cattle slaughters, for instance, punished Spaniards breaking the rules with a substantial fine, but imposed a penalty of 200 lashes on all castes beneath, or classes beneath the Spanish peninsulars. It just depended in many ways on where you were in Spanish colonial society. Although there is no evidence of it being collected in Texas, Afro-Mexicans were subject to the same per capita taxes paid by Indians, the tribute, which is called the tribute, which was not imposed on Spaniards or mestizos. So it really does depend on where you are, what laws and what discriminatory ordinances you might be expected to, or might be forced to adhere to. So we will now talk a bit about Tejanas, women who live on the far northern frontier. Women's place in Spanish Texas probably resembled that of other women in other colonial societies throughout the Americas. Women in the far north escaped from the gender restrictions and roles found in the interior of New Spain, but not entirely. The rigors of frontier life tended to challenge strict gender roles. Women fought off Indians, helped with ranch and farm chores, including herding, and entered into merchant activity. Women's roles still centered on maintaining the household, such as making, repairing, and washing clothes, cultivating local plants in a garden, and making household necessities such as soap. They also included, of course, passing on to children the morals and values of Spanish cultural society, as well as just sort of maintaining parental responsibility over children. Even though the frontier ultimately challenged gender roles, there remained limited social mobility on the frontier for most women. They had little opportunity to establish their own vocation, though some women practiced midwifery as a profession on the frontier. So let's talk a bit about how the law shaped the lives of Tejanas. Women could not vote or hold elective office. A man could legally prevent his wife from leaving him. Women could use the judicial system and be parties to lawsuits, either as plaintiffs or defendants. They could hold material assets, meaning property, and investments independently of their spouse. They could negotiate on their own for the sale of particular goods. Women could keep control of their own property when they married, and women in Spanish Texas enjoyed more legal rights than did their counterparts, actually, from the French and British North American colonies, even though they couldn't vote or hold office. I'll now give you a few examples of women who, or an example of a woman who actually did manage to make quite a good life for herself. Her name is Doña María Hinojosa de Valle, and she's mentioned on the slide entitled Las Tejanas, Women in Colonial Texas. She hailed as Texas's first cattle queen. She inherited a large ranch from her husband, which she then further enlarged through her business savvy. The estate eventually covered much of the lower Rio Grande Valley, as well as Padre Island. Other women similarly experienced success as ranch managers, merchants, or community activists, but not quite to the extent as Doña María Hinojosa de Valle. Lastly, we will talk about Indian accommodation and resistance. So first I'll say a bit about what accommodation and resistance are and how Indians use them. Accommodation and resistance are on either end of a spectrum. Accommodation, resistance. And this spectrum pertains, of course, to the actions that Indians used to shape their lives under the onset of Spanish colonization. Some native people chose to acclimate to Hispanic culture and accommodate the Spanish as a new colonial ruler. Others, at the exact opposite end, chose to resist any and all overtures or armed attacks from the Spanish. Most indigenous people did not adapt strategies, one strategy over another, and instead used a variety of strategies to survive Spanish colonization. Several Indian nations were in position to dictate the terms of their interactions with Spanish authorities, such as we've already seen in Module 2. Indians numbered roughly 7,000 in the 1770s. The choice becomes submission to the mission or resistance. Hunter-gatherer bands inhabited the areas east and south of San Antonio, all the way to the Gulf Coast. These were the most accepting of the mission system, often used the missions as protection from enemies. Some Indians afflicted with disease or starvation also went to the missions, often as a last resort. Many did learn to make trade goods and did learn methods of farming and livestock herding, and many indigenous had accepted aspects of Catholicism by the end of the 18th century, as well as other tenets of European society. So now what I'm going to go through are the groups we had talked about in Lecture 2, Part 1, and we'll see how they've done. So ultimately, Native Americans suffered irreversibly from such factors as frontier warfare, disease, and foreign violation of their territory. The Humanos were absorbed by the Apache Nation. Trade with Caddo partners was disrupted when the Caddos preferred to trade with French Louisiana. Incessant Indian attacks also made trading across Texas very dangerous for the Humano, and eventually they began to ally more and more with the Apache. The Karankawa Indians remained at odds with the Spaniards until the end of the 18th century. Bitter towards the Spaniards over the diseases they imported and the attacks the outsiders made upon Karankawa camps, they didn't become receptive to the idea of missionization until the 1790s, when they were under constant attack from other groups, such as the Comanche. The Caddo Indians weathered the colonial era better than any others. They decline in numbers, but their society remains stable. The Caddo played an influential role in the international trade conducted in Caddo country, with Spanish, French, and Indian traders all seeking their favor. Commercial links with the French become so intimate that they actually modified Caddo society during the 18th century. The Caddo and the French exchanged farm goods and buffalo skins and mustangs for weapons, work tools, hunting equipment, blankets, and clothing. They accepted all of these things from the French. They improved their standard of living and made them much better hunters. Old skills, unfortunately, though, atrophied as the tribe members no longer needed to produce bows and arrows on their own, or traditional crafts, or weaving cloth. When the French left, the Caddo were left on their own and struggled to survive, but maintained a place in their homelands until the 1850s. The Spanish termed the most resistant Indians as Indios Bárbaros. They resisted at all costs. Considered hostile nomadic tribes, many of these actually survived well into the latter years of the 19th century. They saw foreigners as serious threats to their traditional ways of life. These groups included the Apache, the Wichita, which were actually converts to a Plains existence from the Red River area, and these groups openly rejected the presence of interlopers and responded with raids against European settlements, stealing livestock, horses, weapons, tools, and supplies, all items useful for living off the land and waging war. The Apache got their supplies and weapons through the Caddo, actually. Groups like the Comanche would launch an awesome military campaign against Native American competitors and European frontier communities alike. They had success with war strategies and playing the Spanish against their enemies. Treaties signed with one group of the Comanche might not mean anything to another group of the same tribe, and this proved endlessly frustrating for Spanish colonial settlers and officials. So at the end of the 18th century, what the end of the 18th century brought about were serious steps to try to solidify the Spanish hold over North American territory, Texas included. We've looked over several different methods of solidifying control, and I encourage you to assess their success in the discussion forum during this module. We have also considered how Native Americans fared 3 centuries into colonization. This is by far not the end of the story of Native Americans in Texas. The Indios Barbaros that are perhaps the most famous are, of course, the Comanche, and their story is just getting started. We will discuss them further into the semester during different modules. Native Americans never thought of themselves as Native Americans. They were Apache, Comanche, Caddo, or Kiowa. This explains why they did not all band together to try to kick out the Spanish. That would be like expecting Spain and France and England to all get along, and let me tell you, they do not. So the indigenous did what they could with the situation they were presented. How might you have handled it? You may include this in your answer to the questions in the forum post this week. Thank you.